Before there was a Seattle, the Duwamish were here, moving with the tide, the salmon, and the canoe. The Duwamish fished these rivers for thousands of years, setting cedar stake traps across the current. The year was measured by salmon runs, not clocks. They wove the forest into daily life, cedar bark, baskets, blankets, and tools made by hand for generation after generation. In the dark of winter, families gathered inside cedar longhouses. Firelight and stories kept the world alive. This was not an empty shore. Villages and longhouses ringed the bay. Hundreds lived here, with thousands more kin across the inside waters. Inside Old Man House, hearths ran down the cedar hall, and families lived in rows around the fires. This was a working homeland, rich in kinship, but still on the edge of the newcomer's trade world. By 1850, trade was already moving around Puget Sound. Fort Nisqually to the south, Fort Vancouver on the Columbia, Fort Langley to the north. But Elliott Bay had no post of its own. Sial had watched that world for a generation. He knew the ships, knew the value of trade, and saw what it might mean if that trade finally stopped here. The call came from Washington. Go west. Work the land for 4 years, and a married couple could claim a square mile. Gold had pulled the country west. Now the government was promising land. In Cherry Grove, Illinois, the Denny, Boren, and Bell families made the bet real. Arthur Denny saw more than a farm. He saw a lumber city on Puget Sound. They walked 2,000 miles behind oxen. San Francisco was booming and hungry for lumber. Puget Sound had deep water and endless timber. That was the bet. In Portland, Charles Terry joined them with a store packed into crates. Tools, tinware, tobacco, boots, raisins, whiskey. A town kit for a beach with no name. 19-year-old David Denny scouted ahead and sent back the line that decided everything. We have plenty. They named the point New York Alki, New York someday. On November 13, 1851, 24 settlers waded ashore in the rain. Half were children. Terry's goods came up the muddy beach with them. The cabin had no roof. David had fallen sick. That first night, the family slept under canvas on the beach they had crossed a continent to reach. The 5 women sat on a wet log in the downpour and took a big cry. Then they wiped their faces and stayed. Terry opened King County's first store on the Duwamish Bay. Tools and goods went one way. Local knowledge and trade came back. That exchange helped the camp survive. By the next year, Alki was a foothold. A couple of cabins among stumps, a store open, wood smoke rising, and people still there. That spring, Louisa Boren planted sweetbrier seeds she had carried from Illinois. They cried, then they stayed. And staying meant planting beauty. That first winter at Alki was miserable. They realized they'd picked the wrong spot. So they swallowed their pride, rowed across the bay, and started over. Then Doc Maynard arrived by canoe, paddled in by Chief Seattle and Duwamish men, cheerful, useful, and ready to connect this camp to the world. Maynard opened the Seattle Exchange, doctored the sick, gave lots away, and pushed the town to take his friend Seal's name, Seattle. Arthur Denny was strict and organized. Doc Maynard was a generous, chaotic populist. They didn't just compete for land, they had entirely different visions of what Seattle should be. Their street grids collided, and neither man would blink, which is why downtown traffic still hits a crooked seam at Yesler Way. Yesler's steam sawmill roared to life in 1853, becoming the town's heartbeat. Within a few years, cabins, log piles, boats, smoke, and wages clustered around the mill. And by the later 1850s, newcomers outnumbered the Duwamish here. In 1855, the Point Elliott Treaty put it on paper. The region's native nations signed away most of their land in return for promised reservations and the right to keep fishing their old waters. The promise was broken. The Duwamish Reservation the treaty pledged was never built. Settler petitions blocked it, and Duwamish families were pushed out, allowed to stay only where their labor was needed. Chief Seattle, 1864. The city carried his name while the modern world remade his homeland around him. The city kept rising in the name of a man losing his own. Around the mill, a working town took shape. Lumber went out by ship and cash finally flowed. It was a hard, male-heavy town of work crews and muddy boots, until Asa Mercer brought teachers west to help it settle. Land was the other trade, fortunes made or lost across a wooden counter. By 1878, life moved at wagon speed. Planks laid over the mud became First Avenue. By 1880, banks and hotels lined the streets. Seattle meant to last. Pioneer Square crowded with trade, spreading into a true skyline. Town threw itself into growth. Coal piers, log booms, and houses climbing the hills. The coal gamble paid off, bankrolling even bigger plans. By the mid-1880s, Seattle had its first streetcars. It was going places. In 1873, the Northern Pacific Railroad chose Tacoma, not Seattle, for its Puget Sound terminus. The town that wanted to be a city had been knocked down, so it set out to build its own rail line to the coal fields instead. The town refused to shrink. By 1883, it had a proper schoolhouse, Central School, a boom town still built almost entirely of dry timber. Then it turned on its own. In the 1880s downturn, Chinese workers were scapegoated for falling wages, and in February 1886, a mob herded hundreds toward the steamer Queen of the Pacific. Sheriff, courts, Home Guard, and federal troops slowed it, but most Chinese residents were forced out anyway. By the end of the decade, the wood city stood dense and dry along the waterfront. Block after block of timber crowded close. The afternoon of June 6, 1889 was warm and the streets were dusty. It started with a pot of glue. A cabinet maker's assistant threw water on burning glue. The flames caught the wood-shaving floor, and by dark, the entire downtown business district, 25 blocks, was gone. The mills burned. The fire crews stood and watched their hydrants run dry. The morning after, smoke still drifted over 25 blocks of ash where downtown had stood the day before. And almost before the embers cooled, the city refused to stop. The Southern restaurant threw up a canvas tent in the ruins and served meals the very next day. National Guardsmen camped by the armory to keep order over the burned district while the ground was still warm. Before the fire, Dexter Horton's bank looked like this. Counters, ledgers, tellers, and trust built one transaction at a time. And here is the punchline that set the city's character. Dexter Horton's bank vault came through the blaze intact. The cash survived, the city did not. But the businessmen who gathered in the ashes weren't arguing about whether to rebuild, only how. The next morning, the city was just smoking brick and ash, but nobody packed up. Instead, they called a town meeting in the rubble and made a choice. Wood is banned. Brick is mandatory. We go again. Front Street north from Marion, 1890. The first brick blocks already rising straight out of the ash. 1891. Pioneer Square reborn in brick and stone, wider and taller than the wood city it replaced. And the new Front Street, 1892, solid masonry where one afternoon's fire had left nothing but cinders. By 1895, the rebuilt downtown was full of permanent storefronts, like Fred Day's Grocery, a city that had burned to nothing and built itself back bigger. First Avenue at Pioneer Square, 1895. Dense, permanent, unmistakably the city the fire made. And this time the city was ready. A horse-drawn fire engine and its crew. The hard lesson of 1889 turned into a real fire department. In 1895, the Seattle waterfront dozed, sailing ships idling at the Madison Street docks. Hard times had come around again. Another national recession had hit in 1893, and the tired little port was still waiting for it to lift. Then, on July 17, 1897, the steamship Portland docked heavy with a ton of Klondike gold. And just like that, the whole city dropped everything and headed north. Boat after boat steamed out for Alaska. The Australia and a dozen others packed to the rails with men who'd quit their lives to chase a frozen river of gold. On Alaska sailing days, the crowds packed Pier 4 to see them off. 1898, the whole city at the waterfront for the great going out. Every hull that floated was pressed into the rush. Even old sailing barks like the Seminole loaded at the Seattle piers and pointed north. And the going out didn't let up. Years on, as late as 1905, the crowd still jammed the rails of northbound ships. The Klondike had given way to Nome and the Alaska fields, and Seattle was still the gateway to all of it. But Philadelphia's real fortune wasn't in the gold fields. It started by building the fleet. Moran Brothers laid down a whole line of sternwheelers for the Yukon River trade, and it outfitted the rush. Klondike suppliers and their delivery wagons jammed First Avenue, the city selling the dream by the wagonload. At Cooper and Levee, near Yesler Way, a Stampeder's whole year of supplies went out the door at once. Seattle got rich selling the shovels, not swinging them. And Cooper and Levee weren't the only ones cashing in. Outfitters like Carroll Caution Company kitted out the Stampeders head to toe, the whole city in the business of the gold it would never have to dig. You couldn't haul a ton over the passes without dogs, so Seattle outfitted the teams too. Sled dogs lined up outside the Yukon Mining School. Down the wharves went the prospectors with their dogs and sleds and grub stakes, bound for a strike most of them would never make. But the gold did come back, a Great Northern Express shipment from Nome rolling off the docks under armed guard, and most of it stayed in Seattle banks. Among those who came home with a stake were John Nordstrom and Carl Wallen, partners who skipped the next gamble for something steadier. At 4th and Pike, they opened a shoe store. Everyone else chased the gold. These two sold them shoes. Inside, it was just good shoes and honest service, the most sensible thing anyone did with Klondike money. And that store is still selling them today. The gold money turned a boomtown into a metropolis. By 1892, electric streetcars climbed hills that had been forest. And there's David Denny himself aboard one, the boy who scouted ashore in 1851, now writing the city he helped raise. Yesler Way, 1895. The old skid road where logs once slid to the mill, now a busy downtown artery. And look down the street at that big hill stacked with houses. Within a few years, Seattle would begin carving hills just like it down to the ground, rebuilding the land itself. By 1900, 2nd Avenue ran thick with cable cars and crowds, downtown filling in with brick and ambition where stumps had stood a generation before. By 1905, the waterfront and rooftops crowded together, a real skyline where a stump town had stood. The gold rush money turned to stone. 2nd Avenue had become a canyon of stone and brick, banks, offices, and the confidence of new money. At 2nd and Columbia, the streetcars and crowds ran thick between buildings that hadn't existed a decade before, and after dark it glowed. By 1909, 1st Avenue blazed with illuminated signs, a frontier port turned electric boomtown. So in 1912, the city threw itself a party, the Golden Potlatch, a summer festival and parade with its own emblem and king. And the parade came down the avenue, float after float, buried under thousands of fresh flowers. a young city in full bloom. 2nd Avenue, packed end to end, horse teams hauling the big floats. The Tyee, the carnival's mock king. Even the automobiles dressed up. One car lost in blossoms. Every trade wanted in, even the sawmill men. On and on it came. Then it crowned the boom. The Smith Tower, 1914. For years, the tallest building west of the Mississippi, looming over ground that had been mudflats a generation before. By 1900, Denny Hill stood between the harbor and the city's inland expansion. To get from 1st to 2nd Avenue, you had to climb a mountain of dirt. The solution was brutal. Wash the hill into the bay and build on the flat. Downtown was trapped by a mountain. City engineer Reginald Thompson had a wildly arrogant idea. Just hose the mountain into the sea. In 1906, hydraulic water cannons opened fire. Steam shovels bit into the slope, hauling it away, one train car at a time. Block by block, year after year, they chewed the grade down. The scale was shocking. Rivers of mud washed front yards downhill. Loaded cars dumped the earth straight into the tide flats. Whole avenues dropped a full story. At 3rd and Olive, the last corner stood like a cliff. By 1910, you could see right through where a neighborhood once lived. But progress is messy. Families who refused to sell woke up to find their yards washed away. Stubborn citizens found themselves fighting a city that wouldn't wait. But as fast as the hill came down, new level streets were paved. They washed a mountain into the sea and built downtown on top of it. By 1909, Seattle was tired of being called a frontier outpost, so it threw itself a World's Fair to prove it was not one. The Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition. A year out, in 1908, the first curious visitors wandered the half-built fairgrounds, the plaster palaces still going up where a forest had stood. 3 million visitors came. They walked the Pay Streak Midway and gawked at the geyser basin. President Taft visited, and the Japanese Navy was formally reviewed. Most of the plaster palaces came down, but a statue of George Washington they unveiled that summer is still standing on a campus where students walked through the floor plan of a World's Fair. Japanese dignitaries were formally received, the fair facing west across the Pacific. President Taft himself came that fall, greeted on the exposition grounds. Children gathered at the Geyser Basin Fountain, the one students still know as Frosh Pond. Even a baby show drew crowds. The fair had something for everyone. Delegations arrived from across the coast, like Los Angeles at the Watergate. Parades marched the grounds all summer long. The lodges turned out in force. Here, the Elks gathering at the exposition's official photographers building. Every fraternal order in the Northwest wanting its portrait made at the fair. And then the whole table raised a glass to the fair it had dreamed of and built. A toast, a turn to the camera, a good laugh. A frontier town that had just shown the world exactly what it was. Pike Place Market didn't start as a landmark. It started as a revolt. Tired of price-gouging middlemen, farmers just pulled their wagons into the mud, and the city let them sell directly to the people. It was chaotic, loud, and hours. Farmers, shoppers, wagons, and horses packed into one public place, feeding the city face to face. And by 1920, the very same market ran on automobiles. Cars crowding in where the wagons had been, a working town speeding up. These streets were built by communities. William Gross, one of Seattle's first black landowners, ran a downtown hotel and helped anchor the Central District. Then the Oriental Limited pulled into King Street Station, a world-class train arriving at a station built to make Seattle feel like a Pacific capital. Inside King Street Station, the train caller sang out arrivals under the great clock. the city listening for the world. Around King and Jackson, Chinatown and the International District gathered close to the station, a Pacific neighborhood folded into a few blocks. In 1921, the Chinese community filled King Street with the Go Hing Carnival, a lion dance raising famine relief across the sea. Inside shops like Toshiro Hardware, Japanese-American families built businesses meant to last, one counter at a time. Storefront to storefront, signs and shelves turned the neighborhood into an everyday map of work, language, and belonging. Children absorbed it too, playing grocery store with boxes and cans, learning the sidewalk economy by imitation. Across the city, homelands stayed close. Flags, languages, churches, shops, and customs carried into ordinary Seattle rooms. On the sidewalks, newsboys sold the city its own story. Headlines, gossip, disasters, victories, all shouted by working kids. And after work, there were small pleasures, a confectionery, an ice cream parlor, a place to sit down and feel the city becoming livable. In composing rooms, molten type and busy hands turned the day into tomorrow's news. David and Louisa Boren Denny were not marble founders yet. Just young people who had crossed a continent, survived Alki, and kept building a life together in the town they helped begin. Seattle has always been a wonderfully odd, interesting city. Where else does the polar explorer Roald Amundsen turn up downtown with a couple of Chukchi kids he's brought along? The town loved a character and a parade. Here come the old boys of the Seattle Fire Department, marching like they own the street. And it turned out for the big ones, too. When the Great War came, soldiers paraded down 2nd Avenue in 1917 as the whole downtown turned out to see them off. And in 1919, the city filled 2nd Avenue again with a welcome home parade, banners, crowds, and a homecoming for the men who made it back. It threw itself a party for any excuse. The first Founders Day ball, dressed to the nines in a downtown mansion. The city liked a show. At the Palace Hip, chorus girls turned a night out into sparkle, movement, and noise before the Jazz Age fully arrived. An interesting city needs a sound, and Seattle found its first great one on Jackson Street, led by Oscar Holden, who'd played beside Jelly Roll Morton. In the 1920s, a young pianist, Evelyn Bundy, fronted the Garfield Ramblers, a woman leading one of the city's first great jazz bands. Evelyn Bundy's players were the real thing, the Addams brothers among the finest of that first Jackson Street generation. On stage, the band swung the dance halls of Jackson Street into the small hours, and that scene kept producing, straight down the line to a Garfield kid named Quincy Jones. How did a growing city move? At first, on hooves, delivery wagons brought meat, furniture, and everything else to your door. Frederick and Nelson hauled furniture the same way. Horse and wagon, the city's first delivery fleet. Then the wires went up. Streetcar number 8, one of the first electric cars to grind up these hills. By 1907, the streetcar was the cheapest tour in town. By the 1920s, the cars wore safety fenders for everyone who had just learned to jaywalk. Inside, cane seats and a conductor, a moving room the whole city shared. And the first buses nosed through the snow, Seattle pretending it knew how to handle weather. Soon the buses climbed the hills the streetcars never could, and underneath it all, the steamrollers, paving the roads that carried the whole parade. Seattle wasn't handed to us. It was built by restless, imperfect people responding to their times. Workers, shopkeepers, builders, families, all trying to make a city work. And the Duwamish were never just the beginning of the story. They are still here, still hosting Seattle on their homeland, still asking to be seen clearly. Look at the old photographs and you see it. People living downtown, walking downtown, riding streetcars, shopping, working, arguing, gathering. The center was alive because people were in it. Places like Pike Market, Pioneer Square, First Avenue, and Pike Street are more than landmarks. They are the heartbeat, the shared places where a city remembers how to be alive. Our challenge now is to preserve and grow that heart. Not just offices, not just business, but streets and markets and rooms where people come together again. That pioneer spirit is not about worshiping the past. It is about accepting the challenge in front of us, to make downtown a beautiful, living city again. This is our shared inheritance. The city isn't finished. It's our turn now to bring people back to the heart and build the next Seattle together. Before the Coliseum, this was just another downtown corner. In 1887, the Seattle Street Railway kept its horse car barn a couple of blocks off at 2nd and Pike, the neighborhood still half built, waiting for something grander. By 1910, the moving pictures had caught fire, outgrowing the storefront Nickelodeons. 2nd Avenue bustled just downhill, a city ready for a real movie palace. B. Marcus Proteca was still a young architect when he drew the Coliseum, a theater built not for vaudeville, but for movies. His rendering promised the arched corner and dome before they existed, a movie palace planned as a civic landmark. Then it rose. This is August 1915, the bare steel framework climbing the corner at 5th and Pike. By November, the walls had taken shape. Proteca's movie palace coming out of the ground, still months from its first blazing night. Finished at last, 1916. By daylight, the great corner read clean and modern, the arched entrance and pale facade that would anchor the block for decades. And at night, the whole facade blazed, the great half-dome entrance outlined in thousands of bulbs over the wet street. Opening day, 1916. Crowds thronged the domed corner entrance to step inside the future of how the world would watch the world. By the 1920s, the marquee glowed for the stars of the day, Colleen Moore in Desert Flower, 1925, and Ronald Colman in Bulldog Drummond, 1929. The blade signs lit the corner for decades. Step inside, the great auditorium, every seat facing Proteca's elliptical proscenium and pleated curtain. Look up, the coffered dome and the arched organ pipe grille set in ornate plasterwork. From the balcony, the swagged grand curtain framed by the sounding board proscenium. The domed entrance rotunda, dressed with greenery and globe lights for the theater's 9th anniversary. And the mighty theater organ console on the orchestra platform ready to fill the hall. Overhead, a painted ceiling medallion ringed in plaster, every surface meant to make a night out feel grand. It played movies until March 11, 1990, when its last screening was Tremors. After restoration and seismic work, Banana Republic opened here in 1994 and stayed until 2020. For a while, its next life was retail. Banana Republic under Proteca's old dome, the movie palace adapted but still recognizable at 5th and Pike. After COVID, Banana Republic shut down and never returned. The marquee and sign came down. The old theater stood exposed again at 5th and Pike. What if the Coliseum came back, not as a memory, but as a room full of light, music, and people again? The drawings still exist. The dream is visible. Let's look at a survivor on First Avenue, 1315. Around 1900, it was the Hotel Vendome, with C. Sidney Shepherd and Company filling the ground floor in hardware and metalware, hotel rooms above. From the rear in 1908, it looked straight over Railroad Avenue, the freight sheds, wharves, and saltwater traffic that powered downtown. By 1917, it wore a new name, the Hotel New Vendome, and a parade came marching up First Avenue right past its doors, the whole street alive. Another view of the same day, the column still marching past the New Vendome, the sidewalks packed the length of the block. By 1926, First Avenue had become a theater of storefronts and street life. The names and tenants changed, but the bones of the old building held. Here's the block in 2020, boarded up for almost a decade. We acquired it in 2023. And here it is today, the same survivor wearing a temporary flower mural, waiting for its next beautiful life. Start at 5th and Pike. The Coliseum blazing at night, the east end of the walk. A block downhill, 4th and Pike looked like this in 1901. Wallene and Nordstrom selling shoes from one storefront. At 3rd and Pike, hotels and signs crowded the street. The middle stretch between Market and Movie Palace. At 2nd and Pike, the hill was already busy. Streetcars, storefronts, and people moving between the waterfront and the retail core. Sometimes the same corner became a crowd scene, bands, spectators, and the street itself as entertainment. Then Pike opens into the market, wagons, farmers, drays, and the everyday city at its most alive. Turn onto First and the Vendome comes into view, the 1315 First Avenue survivor in its new Vendome years. And here is the same block today, 1315 First Avenue, still waiting for its next beautiful life. Even the temporary flower mural belongs to this First Avenue story, a modern signpost at the end of the walk. Some of Seattle's hidden gems are meant to be beautiful again. The Waltham Block, the Hotel Vendome, the Coliseum. I've come to own these places, and I've been bringing them back to life. We start with the oldest, the Waltham Block, 311 Occidental Avenue South, built in 1890. It begins with fire. On June 6, 1889, the Great Seattle Fire took 25 blocks of wood frame downtown, this corner of Occidental among them. The district burned to the waterline. People hear Occidental and picture the Grand Occidental Hotel. But that ornate pile stood 2 blocks north, on the wedge at James and Yesler. It gave the avenue its name. It is not the building in this story. The Waltham Block rose straight out of those ashes. 3 stories of brick and stone where the wood frame town had stood, and the whole district rebuilt around it. Here the Schwabacher Brothers storefront in 1901, the avenue back in business. Occidental Avenue filled back in, wagons, streetcars, storefronts. Here it is under snow in 1916, the brick blocks lining the street. The iron pergola and the Tlingit totem made this square famous, though those came later, in 1909 and after. And the open Occidental Plaza wasn't carved out until 1971. This is the square around 1912, the world this block lived in. And here it is today, the same 1890 brick, restored and open, full of beautiful things again.